So here we are at the Australian Army Tank Museum, about 120 kilometres north of Melbourne in Puckapunyal, Victoria, taking a look at some of the armoured vehicles in their collection from the World War II era. So this is a vehicle I've done a video on before, and I wanted to redo the video because in the first one I kept incorrectly referring to it as the Cruiser Mark IV tank. It is, of course, the Cruiser Mark VI or Crusader Mark I. Which is here in the collection. So British tank doctrine recognised as it entered World War II two types of tanks: infantry tanks, which were designed to support infantry on the move and were typically slow moving, were mounted with guns that were designed to fire high explosive rounds to break up fixed emplacements and to support the infantry primarily, and cruiser tanks, which were designed to break through enemy lines, travel rapidly into the rear and disrupt enemy communications, and primarily to engage other armoured vehicles they might encounter, and so consequently had guns mounted to them that were designed for an anti-tank type role or an anti-armour type role. So this was the Mark VI Cruiser, so the sixth iteration, design iteration that they'd gone through, and this was the first vehicle that was considered suitable for employment against the Germans in large numbers. So at the start of the war, the British had deployed some tanks to France, but not many, and certainly were concerned with potentially losing them, and they did lose a lot when they withdrew their forces after the very rapid German advance. And so this vehicle here, the Crusader, was first employed in the Western Desert in large numbers. And while it had problems, while it suffered from a lot of mechanical issues, while it suffered from overheating, while its Nuffield Liberty engine was not considered fantastic, it did serve its purpose at the start of the war and break up attacks in the Western Desert that were being mounted by Italian forces and then later German forces. Now, this is the Mark I version of the Crusader, or Cruiser Mark VI, that was sent here to Australia for trials. One of the really interesting things about this very early version, the Mark I, is that you can see that the Beezer machine gun at the front of the hull is mounted in a small turret. And this was the last time you saw this sort of turreted machine gun design on British tanks, British cruiser tanks at least, in World War II. So only this Mark I version of the Crusader got this turret, and afterwards they removed it. And to be honest, in the field, a lot of British units removed this turret because it was difficult to use, difficult to see out of, and wasn't a great way of employing a machine gun. But of course, the advantage of a turret would be that you could rotate it and fire the gun in a completely different aspect to that which the tank was facing. So if the tank was facing straight ahead, you could turn the turret 90 degrees and engage infantry off to the side. But this was the last time it was used in this configuration. As a cruiser tank, and to make breakthroughs, typically these vehicles had high top speed. So the top speed of this tank was around 42 kilometres per hour on the road, which was definitely at the upper end for most World War II tanks. Initially had a crew of 5 when fitted with this 2-pounder AT gun, as it is in this configuration. But later in the war, as it started to encounter tougher and tougher German opponents, that 2-pounder anti-tank gun was upgraded to a 6-pounder anti-tank gun. And at that time, they had to drop back one crew member in the turret because there was no more room for a three men in the turret of the vehicle. Now, about 5,300 of these were produced in all types, and it was employed in North Africa from May 1941 onwards, serving next to units that were equipped with Matilda IIs. And it began to be supplemented with M3 medium tanks that the US was supplying under Lend-Lease, such as the Lee and the Grant, and ultimately supplanted by the Sherman. But it was a great stopgap and the only tank that was really available for the British to employ in the desert in any large numbers until those Lend-Lease vehicles, which were a bit more reliable and loved a bit more by the Tank Corps themselves, became available. So what else can we say about this vehicle? So as a cruiser, suspension is important. So here we have a development of the so-called Christie suspension. So the vehicles are on swing arms, which rotate in an arc up and down and are controlled by vertical springs, which are mounted inboard of the road wheels. Typical British tank configuration, cruiser tank configuration, you've got a rear-mounted engine with a rear drive sprocket and rear transmission. So the drive is a bit remote from the drive line, but everything drive line wise is contained to the back of the vehicle. So again, with this Christie type suspension, the road wheels are able to rotate and articulate, and the amount of articulation is controlled by a vertical spring, and that vertical spring in a Christie is typically inboard of that plate that you can see, so you can't see the spring. It's mounted inboard to keep it clear of dust and muck and all the rest of it, and typically provide a great off-road performance. And that was very similar to the suspension that was employed upon the T34 and was used on a lot of British cruisers. So even the cruiser before this, the Mark V Covenanter, used this similar suspension, though that tank was never employed overseas. It was considered unsuitable due to its poor reliability, and it was used later in the Cromwell tanks in a similar configuration. So a very good suspension if you want high-speed travel. So being a British tank from particularly early in the war, you can see a lot of riveted construction. So we're talking about armour plates that are riveted to a subframe to hold the tank together. Not an optimal configuration or an optimal way of constructing things by any stretch of the imagination. Those rivets can easily shear off if you're hit by a round, and the tail or the head of the rivet on the inside of the vehicle can become a projectile, which can take out the crew. So in the back here, you've got a V12 engine, the so-called Nuffield Liberty, which is a localized version of the US Liberty engine that was produced by Nuffield in the UK. So that engine had a lot of issues when it was initially implemented, and had difficulty in the desert with reliability, which is why the British switched over to the M3s and M4s when they could, as well as the bigger punch that you got with some of the guns that were available on the M3 and the M4 Shermans. So again, it was the tank that blunted multiple assaults by the Italians and took them out in the early parts of World War II. So again, this very early configuration, the Mark I, with its turret-mounted visor and its 2-pounder anti-tank gun here at the Australian Army Tank Museum. So if you get the chance, come down and take a look. Great way to appreciate some of the tank developments in the early war period.